He runs an empire built on fear. His name alone clears rooms. He has tattoos climbing his neck like warnings, and a scar on his lip that tells you everything you need to know about the life he chose before the life he has now. He is one of the most powerful and dangerous men in Atlanta. And he was sitting alone in the dark, holding his black wife's phone like a desperate, frightened man. Jade is a pediatric oncologist, a Black woman who holds the hands of dying children and finds a way to stay present without breaking. Beautiful, brilliant, and patient in ways that a man like him had never once deserved. She came home every night and reached for him in her sleep. Every single night. And he repaid that love by bugging her phone. 3 weeks of private calls in the corridor. 3 weeks of eyes that looked slightly different when she came back to bed. That was all it took for the man who had never feared anything in his life to become something he had spent 20 years making sure he would never be. Vulnerable. So he installed the surveillance. He told himself it was instinct. He told himself it was caution. He told himself 100 things that were not true. And then the call came. And what he heard on the other end of that line did not expose her. It exposed him. Completely. Irreversibly. In a way that no rival, no enemy, no weapon had ever managed to do in 38 years of a life lived entirely on the offensive. What Jung Hyun-woo heard on that recording froze him for 43 minutes and changed everything that came after. Before starting the story, comment down below where you are watching from and what time it is there. If stories of karma, love, and hidden truths move you, leave a like. Be sure to subscribe to the channel and click join to become a member and help our channel. There is a particular kind of silence that only exists in rooms where powerful men are lying to themselves. Not the silence of peace. Not the silence of rest. The silence of a man sitting completely still while everything inside him is moving. Fast, erratic, wrong. Like a machine running at a speed it was never designed for, vibrating toward its own destruction while the outside casing holds perfectly still. Jung Hyun-woo knew that silence better than he knew almost anything else in the world. He had grown up inside it. He had built an empire from within it. And on this particular night, in the upper office of a mansion in Buckhead, Atlanta, a home with marble floors imported from Tuscany and security systems that cost more annually than most people earned in a decade, he was sitting inside that silence again. Alone. The lights off. The city glowing amber and gold through the floor-to-ceiling windows behind him, casting just enough light to catch the edge of his jaw, the sharp line of his cheekbone, and the ink that climbed his neck in dark, coiling shapes that had meant something once, a long time ago, when he was a different kind of animal. He was holding her phone. He had taken it from the nightstand 17 minutes ago. He had timed it. He knew exactly how long he had before the household rhythm would shift, before Jade would roll over in her sleep and reach, the way she always reached. Not urgently, just instinctively, toward his side of the bed. She did that. Every night. Even on the nights he was not there. Derek had mentioned it once, casually, having seen it on a security feed, and Hyun-woo had said nothing in response and felt something crack very quietly behind his sternum. She reached for him even in her sleep. And he was in the office above her, holding her phone like evidence. He told himself it was caution. He told himself it was the same instinct that had kept him alive for 2 decades in a world that consumed men like him without ceremony or pause. He told himself that a man in his position could not afford to be naive, that love was not armor, That tenderness did not neutralize threat, that even the most genuine-seeming warmth could be a strategy employed by someone who understood what he valued and had decided to use it. He had seen it done. He had ordered it done. He told himself all of these things, and none of them were true. And somewhere beneath the architecture of logic he had carefully constructed around his own chest, he knew it. The truth was simpler and far more humiliating. The truth was that 3 weeks ago, Jade had started taking phone calls in the corridor. Not every call, not obviously, but enough. Enough that a man who had spent his entire adult life reading rooms and reading people, reading the micro-expressions on the face of a rival who was about to betray him, reading the slight shift in posture that meant someone had been turned, reading the silence between words for what the words were covering, had noticed. And once he noticed, he could not unnotice. She had come back to bed after one of those calls, with her eyes slightly different. Not sad, not guilty. Something else. Something private. Something that belonged entirely to her and to whoever was on the other end of that line. And that exclusion, that small, soft, utterly ordinary act of having a private feeling, had lodged itself in Hyunwoo like a splinter so deep that pressing on the skin above it produced no visible mark, but a pain entirely out of proportion to its size. He had asked her once, kept his voice level, kept his face neutral. He was extraordinary at both. She had said, "Everything is fine, just tired." And she had smiled at him, that specific smile, the one that had stopped him in the middle of a room full of people 4 years ago and rearranged something fundamental in how he understood what he wanted from the time he had left. And he had nodded and said nothing more. But the splinter stayed. And it grew. And tonight, after weeks of carrying it, Jang Hyunwoo, Black Wolf, the man whose name was spoken carefully in 3 countries, had walked into the room where his wife slept peacefully and taken her phone from the nightstand like a common, desperate, frightened man. Because that is what he was. He opened the monitoring application he had prepared 3 days earlier, had it built specifically by a technician who would never speak of it, tested twice on a secondary device before tonight, and installed it in under 40 seconds. His hands did not shake. They never shook. That was perhaps the saddest part of it. His hands were perfectly steady while he did the worst thing he had done in years. And the worst thing he had done in years was not violence, was not leverage, was not the quiet annihilation of a business rival. It was this: surveilling the woman who reached for him in her sleep. He placed the phone back on the nightstand with surgical precision, adjusted its angle to match exactly how it had been resting, looked at Jade for 1 moment, the slow rise and fall of her breathing, the loose coils of her hair against the pillow, the way her hand had already moved toward his empty side of the bed, even in that brief time, and he walked back upstairs without making a sound. Derek was waiting in the doorway of the office. He had said nothing when he saw what Hyunwoo had done. He had not needed to. Derek Ashford had been at Hyunwoo's right hand for 11 years, and in 11 years, he had learned that there were moments when speaking was genuinely useless. Not because the boss wouldn't listen, but because the boss already knew exactly what the words would be, and had already made his peace with ignoring them. This was one of those moments. "Don't," was all Derek said. "Already done," was all Hyunwoo said back. And then there was that silence again. The specific one. The machine running too fast one. The one that Hyunwoo had learned to wear over his face like a second skin. so that no one in any room he entered could ever see how fast and how wrong things were moving inside him. Derek left without another word. Hyunwoo sat down, and he waited. Because this was the other thing that men like him were extraordinarily good at. The patience that looked like calm. The stillness that was actually just coiled tension, waiting for the single piece of information that would justify everything. The fragment of evidence that would make the sleeplessness make sense. The proof that the instinct was right. That the splinter was real. That the fear, the specific, humiliating, foundational fear that had lived in his chest since he was 14 years old and learned that the people who were supposed to stay always left, was not irrational. He waited for it the way he had waited for other things in other dark rooms over other long years. The difference was that this time, he was waiting to be right about the woman he loved. And somewhere underneath even that, underneath the justifications and the trained calm and the architecture of self-protection he had spent his entire life constructing, something smaller and quieter was waiting too. Something that did not have a name in the language he used for strategy and business and survival. Something that was, if he had been willing to look directly at it, closer to a prayer than anything else. The prayer of a man who had never learned to ask for what he needed, and so had developed, as compensation, an elaborate and destructive talent for taking instead. The prayer that went, "Let me be wrong. Let there be nothing there. Let her be exactly what she has always seemed to be, and let me be the problem, because a problem I can fix. But losing her I cannot survive, and I know that. I have always known that, and I have never once told her, because telling her would mean she knew exactly how much power she had, and giving anyone that kind of power over me is the one thing I was taught, at 14 years old, in a room I do not speak about, never to do." The city glowed through the windows. The house held its breath. Hyunwoo sat in the dark with her phone under surveillance, and his empire intact, and his chest quietly, precisely, coming apart. And waited for the morning. The first 4 days produced nothing. Nothing meaningful. Nothing that fed the paranoia or quieted it, which was its own particular kind of torture, because a man like Hyunwoo could work with information, could dismantle information, could turn information into action and action into resolution. What he could not work with was the absence of it. The void where the answers should have been. The 4 days of ordinary calls that piled up in the monitoring application like evidence of his own absurdity. Her sister, Brianna, called twice. Once to complain about a man named Curtis who had apparently forgotten their anniversary for the second consecutive year, and once to ask Jade whether she thought a certain shade of terracotta was too aggressive for a living room wall. Jade had said she liked terracotta, that it was warm, that warm colors made people feel held. Hyunwoo had listened to that particular call while sitting in the back of a car moving through downtown Atlanta, Derek in the front passenger seat reviewing a logistics report, and he had looked out the window at the city passing by and thought, with a clarity that was almost violent, that he had never once in his life made anyone feel held. He had made people feel safe, yes. The specific safety of proximity to power. The safety of knowing that nothing external could reach you while you stood close enough to the wolf. But that was not the same thing. Jade would know the difference. Jade, who held the hands of children who were dying, and found ways to be present in that without flinching, who came home from 12-hour shifts and still asked him how his day was, and actually listened to the answer. The version of the answer he could give her, which was never the whole answer, but which she received without pressure or complaint. Jade would know precisely the difference between being protected and being held. He wondered, not for the first time and with more honesty than usual, which one he had actually been offering her. Tasha called on the third day, Jade's closest friend, a woman with a voice like a radio presenter and a laugh that arrived before the joke did. They talked for 41 minutes about a charity gala neither of them wanted to attend, a colleague at the hospital who had apparently taken credit for someone else's research, and whether or not Jade had told him yet. Hyunwoo's hand tightened on the phone. Told him what? He replayed those 3 words 6 times. Told him yet. The yet was the operative word. It implied a timeline, a decision being made, a deliberate withholding. It implied that there was something Jade knew and had chosen, actively chosen, not to bring to him. And Tasha knew. Tasha, who had looked at Hyunwoo with polite and completely unconvincing warmth at every dinner they had shared, who had hugged Jade goodbye at their front door with the specific ferocity of a woman who was worried about her friend. Tasha knew, and Jade had not told him. And the call moved on before he could hear anything more, because Jade had laughed. Actually laughed, loose and real, and said, "Not yet. Soon. I'm waiting for the right moment." The right moment. He set the phone down on his desk and stared at the wall for a long time. Derek appeared in the doorway at some point during that stretch of staring. Hyunwoo could not have said exactly when, and looked at his face and said nothing for several seconds. "You look like a man who just found something and doesn't know what it means yet," Derek said finally. "I haven't found anything, that's what I mean." Hyunwoo did not respond. Derek sat down across from him anyway, uninvited, the way he occasionally did when he had decided that what the boss needed was company rather than deference. It was one of the few things Hyunwoo permitted him that he permitted no one else. "She said she's waiting for the right moment," Hyunwoo said. "To tell me something." Derek's expression did not change. It was a very controlled non-change, the kind that Hyunwoo, who read people for a living, noticed immediately. Derek knew how to hold a face still, but the stillness itself was information. "You know something," Hyunwoo said. "I know a lot of things. About this." Derek held the eye contact for a moment, then looked away. Out the window, at the city, at the middle distance where people looked when they were deciding how much truth to carry into a room. "She'll tell you," he said. "Give her time." "That's not an answer. It's the only one I have for you right now." They sat with that. The room did not fill with anything comfortable. Hyunwoo did not push further. Not because he didn't want the answer, but because something in Derek's voice had introduced a note he hadn't expected. Not guilt, not evasion, something closer to protectiveness. Derek was protecting Jade, had taken her side, or her timeline, over his. And the fact that this did not enrage him, that it produced instead a dull, aching thing that felt almost like respect, told him more about his own state of mind than he wanted to examine. He dismissed Derek with a look and went back to waiting. The call came on the 5th day. He was in a meeting, 12 people around a table in the import company's conference room. Legitimate business, real numbers, a quarterly review that required his actual attention and received perhaps 40% of it. The monitoring application sent a silent notification to his secondary device. Unknown number, active call. Recording in progress. He looked at Derek across the table. Derek looked back. "Out," Hyunwoo said. One word in Korean. 12 people filed out of the room with the practiced efficiency of people who had learned not to ask questions. Derek was the last to leave. He paused at the door. Hyunwoo had already put the earpiece in. He pressed play. The recording had a slight delay, 2-3 seconds of ambient sound before the call connected. He could hear the hospital in the background of Jade's side. The specific texture of that place, the low-frequency hum of ventilation systems, a distant intercom, the particular acoustic quality of wide corridors with hard floors. He knew that soundscape. He had picked her up from that hospital hundreds of times. He had sat in that parking structure and watched the entrance and felt something embarrassingly close to pride every single time she came through those doors. He heard her say, "Hello?" The voice on the other end was professional, measured. A woman, clinical in cadence, careful with words, the specific vocal register of someone who delivered significant news regularly and had learned to do it with gentleness that did not become softness. She identified herself. Clinic. Results. Prenatal. The word landed in Hyunwoo's chest before his mind had fully processed it. Prenatal. Jade said, "Go ahead." Her voice was different. Not the voice she used with Tasha, loose and laughing. Not the voice she used with him, warm and measured. This was the voice underneath those voices. The one that came out when she was alone and did not need to be anything for anyone. Slightly unsteady at the edges. Present in a way that the other versions of her voice were not always required to be. She was afraid. She was hopeful. She was holding both of those things at once in her voice, and neither of them was winning. The woman on the phone said, "Everything is within normal range. 8 weeks and 4 days. Strong cardiac activity. You have a healthy pregnancy, Dr. Carter Jang." 3 seconds of silence. Not the silence of Hyunwoo's dark office. Not the silence of a man lying to himself. This was a different kind entirely. The silence of someone who has been holding their breath for longer than they realized and has just been told it is safe, finally safe, to exhale. And then Jade cried. It was not theatrical. It was not the kind of crying that announces itself or asks to be witnessed. It was the crying of a woman who had been carrying something enormous and private and frightening through her daily life. Through her shifts at the hospital, through dinners with her husband, through nights where she lay beside him and reached for him and said everything is fine, just tired. And had finally, in the relative privacy of a corridor phone call, allowed the weight of it to come out of her body through the only opening available. She said, "Thank you." Barely. Breath more than words. The call ended. Hyunwoo sat in the empty conference room for 43 minutes. He knew it was 43 minutes because the clock on the wall was directly in his eye line, and he was aware of every single one of them passing and unable to do anything about any of them. The earpiece was still in. The recording had ended. The room was very quiet, and the city moved past the windows the way cities do. Indifferent, continuous, unbothered by the specific devastation of any single person within them. 8 weeks and 4 days. Strong cardiac activity. She had been carrying his child for 8 weeks and 4 days, and she had not told him. And she had told Tasha she was waiting for the right moment, and the right moment had not yet come. And it had not yet come because he had made it so that it hadn't. He had done that. He had been so consumed by the architecture of his own fear, so certain that the private phone calls and the different eyes and the corridor conversations were evidence of something being taken from him, that he had not once considered the possibility that they were evidence of something being protected. She was not keeping a secret from him. She was keeping a secret for him, waiting until he was ready, waiting until she believed, and this was the part that arrived last, the part that was sharpest, that she had found the right moment because she was not certain, was genuinely uncertain, whether the man she had married had room inside the life he lived for what she was carrying. She had loved him carefully enough to wait, and he had surveilled her for it. The door opened. Derek stepped back in, looked at Hyunwoo's face, and went completely still. "She's pregnant," Hyunwoo said. Derek closed his eyes for exactly 1 second. "I know," he said. The word landed between them like something dropped from a great height. Not explosive, not the sharp crack of something shattering, more like the sound of something very dense hitting the floor of a very quiet room. A resonance that moved through the walls and the furniture and the air and continued moving long after the initial impact, so that the silence that followed it was not actually silence at all, but the ongoing vibration of a single, devastating syllable. "I know." Hyunwoo looked at Derek the way he had looked at very few people in his life. Without the filter, without the management, without the carefully maintained surface that kept the interior invisible. It was not a look Derek had seen often, perhaps 4 times in 11 years. Each time it had meant that something had broken through to a layer of Hyunwoo that the man himself rarely acknowledged existed. "How long?" Hyunwoo said. It was not quite a question. The inflection was flat, factual. The voice of a man collecting information because information was the only currency he trusted when everything else had become unreliable. 2 weeks, Derek said. "She called me." The slight widening of Hyunwoo's eyes lasted less than a second. A lesser observer would have missed it entirely. Derek did not miss it. "She didn't call to tell me," Derek continued, because he understood instinctively that the full truth was the only thing that would serve either of them now. "She called to ask about you. She wanted to know if you seemed," her word was ready, "whether you seemed ready. Whether something was weighing on you that she didn't know about. She said you had been different for weeks, and she couldn't tell if it was business or something else, and she didn't want to add to it if the timing was wrong." Hyunwoo said nothing. "She asked me," Derek said, "whether you were happy." The word happy moved through the room with a particular cruelty that neither man commented on. It was not a word that lived comfortably in the vocabulary of their world. It was a civilian word, a word that belonged to people whose problems did not require offshore accounts and security sweeps, and the kind of loyalty that was purchased rather than chosen. And yet Jade had used it, had called the man who managed the operational infrastructure of her husband's criminal empire and asked him earnestly whether her husband was happy. Because she wanted to know before she told him she was carrying his child. Because the happiness of the man who had installed surveillance software on her phone 2 weeks later was something she had considered, carefully and lovingly, before introducing any additional weight into his life. "What did you tell her?" Hyunwoo said. "I told her you were the most closed-off man I had ever known in my life," Derek said, "and that you would come apart at the seams the moment she told you." "In a good way," Hyunwoo said. Not a question either. A clarification. As if it mattered. As if the distinction between coming apart in grief and coming apart in something else was information worth establishing precisely. "In the best way I could imagine," Derek said. "Yes." Another silence. This one was different from the ones that had preceded it throughout this long and quietly catastrophic week. This one had less architecture to it. Less of the controlled, managed quality of Hyunwoo's constructed calm. It was raw. More like the silence that exists in the immediate aftermath of an impact, before the body has finished deciding how badly it has been hurt. I put surveillance on her phone because I thought she was... Hyunwoo stopped, started again. Because she was taking calls she didn't tell me about. Because she came back from them with different eyes. Because He stopped again. Derek waited. Because I am exactly what I have always been. Hyunwoo said finally. And that has never been a problem before. Because it has never mattered before the way it matters now. Derek sat down. Not across the table this time, in the chair directly beside Hyunwoo. Close enough that the gesture itself was a statement. They were not boss and subordinate in this moment, and both of them understood it without negotiation. You know what the problem is, Derek said. Not the surveillance. The surveillance is a symptom. I know what the problem is. Do you? Because I've watched you manage it for 11 years, and I've never once seen you name it out loud. Hyunwoo turned to look at him. The expression on his face was not anger. It was something far more exposed than anger. Something that sat in the territory between acknowledgement and grief, occupying the specific emotional coordinates of a man who is about to say something true that he has never said before and feels the full weight of its novelty. I don't know how to trust that something stays, he said. Quiet. I have never known that. I was taught, specifically, deliberately taught by people who should have done something entirely different. That the correct response to wanting something is to secure it. Control the variables. Eliminate the unknowns. If you can monitor it, you can manage it. If you can manage it, it cannot leave without your permission. He paused. Jade cannot be managed. She has never allowed it. And instead of understanding that as the thing it actually is, which is her fundamental dignity, which is what I loved about her from the first moment, I have spent the last 3 weeks treating it as a threat. Derek was quiet for a long time. You have to tell her, he said finally. I know. Not just about the phone. About why. I know. Because she is going to raise your child, Hyun. And she is going to do it with everything she has. And the absolute least she deserves is to know who she is doing it beside. The afternoon light had shifted while they sat there. The conference room, which had been filled with 12 people and quarterly figures just over an hour ago, held only the two of them now, and the long western light coming through the glass, and the specific gravity of a conversation that had taken 11 years to become possible. Hyunwoo stood, straightened his jacket by reflex, the automatic reassembly of the exterior self that his hands performed without instruction from any conscious part of him. Go home, Derek said. She doesn't finish until 8. Then go home and wait for her there. Not in the office, not at the desk. Be in the house, Hyun. Be somewhere she can find you when she walks through the door. He was in the kitchen when she came in. Not cooking. He had considered it and dismissed it as performance, as the deployment of a gesture where what was required was the absence of strategy entirely. He was simply there, sitting at the kitchen table in the dark, in a black t-shirt and sweatpants, without the watch or the jacket or any of the other elements of the exterior self he typically maintained with such precision. Just the man. Just the tattoos climbing his neck and the scar at the corner of his mouth, and the hands that were resting flat on the table surface because he had decided somewhere on the drive home that he was done giving his hands things to hold on to. She came in at 22 minutes past 10. He heard her keys, then the soft sound of her setting her bag down near the entrance, then the click of the kitchen light. She stopped when she saw him. Not startled. She knew he was home. The car was in the drive. But something in the configuration of him gave her pause. The darkness he'd been sitting in before she hit the light. The stillness. The absence of all the things he usually wore between himself and the world. Hyun. She said his name the way she always said it, with a specific warmth that he had never been able to fully account for, that arrived in his name from her mouth as though the syllable itself meant something different in her language than it did in anyone else's. What's wrong? He looked at her for a moment. This woman, this extraordinary, careful, loving, patient woman who had called his subordinate to ask whether he was happy before telling him she was pregnant with his child, who wore the bracelet he had given her even in sleep, who had stood at an altar beside a man whose hands were not clean and said yes anyway, and had meant it, had continued meaning it, was meaning it still even now while she stood in the kitchen doorway with her work bag dropped and her natural hair slightly compressed on one side from a long shift, and her eyes doing that thing they did. Finding him, specifically him, in whatever room he was in, with that quality of attention that made him feel, against every available evidence of his own history, like someone worth finding. He placed her phone on the table. Screen up, application visible. She looked at it, at him, back at it, and the room held itself very still while Jade Elaine Carter Jang understood what she was seeing, and Jung Hyun-woo sat across from her without defense or distance or the managed surface he had spent his entire life perfecting, waiting for her judgment. For the first time in his life, genuinely waiting for it. Not to manage it, not to survive it, just to receive it. Whatever it was. She did not speak immediately. That was the thing about Jade that had undone him from the very beginning. The way she inhabited silence without filling it, without flinching from it, without reaching for words to cover the discomfort the way most people did. She had the patience of someone who had sat beside children in the worst moments of their lives and learned that presence was sometimes more honest than language. She stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the phone on the table and then at the man behind it. And she did not perform a reaction. She simply had one, privately, behind her eyes, and let it move through her at whatever speed it needed to move. When she finally came to the table, she did not sit across from him. She pulled out the chair beside him, sat down close enough that their arms were nearly touching, looked at the phone one more time, at the application interface, the recording logs, the timestamps stretching back 5 days, and then she turned and looked directly at him. "You grabbed my phone," she said. Her voice was level, not cold. Jade's voice was constitutionally incapable of cold. It was one of the things about her that had always struck him as almost impractical, given the world she moved through. But level, precise. The voice of a woman who was going to understand this completely before she decided what to do with it. "Yes," he said. "Why?" Not, "Why did you do this?" Not, "How could you?" Just why. The root of it. The thing underneath the action. She was already past the surface and into the structure of it, the way she always was. The way that had always made him feel simultaneously seen and exposed in proportions he could not always manage. "Because you were taking calls you didn't tell me about," he said. "And you came back from them different. And He stopped, breathed, started again from a truer place. "And I am a man who was taught, very early and very thoroughly, that the correct response to fearing the loss of something is to surveil it, control it, eliminate the variables. And I applied that to you. I applied the worst of what I am to the best thing in my life. And I have been sitting in this kitchen for 2 hours, trying to find a version of that which is acceptable. And there is not one. Jade was quiet. "What did you hear?" she said. He looked at her directly. He owed her that. The directness, the full weight of his eyes on her face while he said it. No looking away, no management. "That you are 8 weeks and 4 days pregnant," he said. "That the cardiac activity is strong. That you have been carrying this alone for weeks, and that you were waiting." His voice shifted, almost imperceptibly, but she caught it. She always caught everything. "For the right moment to tell me. And that the right moment had not come because of how I had been. Because of what I had made the climate between us into, without ever saying a word about why." The kitchen held them. Outside, Atlanta moved through its nighttime rhythms. Sirens at a distance, the low percussion of the city that never fully quieted. Inside, there was only the two of them and the phone on the table, and the thing that had just been laid out between them with a completeness that left nowhere to hide. "I wanted to tell you the night I found out," Jade said. Her voice had changed. The precision was still there, but something underneath it had loosened. The way a held breath releases not all at once, but in stages. Each one a small act of trust. I was sitting in my car in the hospital parking structure at 11 at night, and I had just looked at the test, and my very first thought, before anything else, was you. I wanted to call you immediately. I almost did. "Why didn't you?" he said. "Because you'd been distant for 2 weeks at that point. And I know you, Hyun. I know how you carry things. And I couldn't read what you were carrying, and I didn't want to." She paused, found the exact words. "I didn't want to hand you something that required your whole heart when I wasn't sure your whole heart was available. I was protecting the news. I was protecting what it deserved to be, which was something received with space and presence, and not crowded in alongside whatever else you were already holding." He absorbed this. "I was holding," he said slowly, "the fear that you were pulling away from me." She looked at him. "And you were pulling away from me," she said, "because you were afraid I was pulling away from you." The irony of it arrived in the room without fanfare. No dramatic swell, no external punctuation. Just the quiet, devastating symmetry of two people who loved each other, having spent weeks in adjacent suffering that was entirely generated by the collision of his damage with her consideration of his damage. "Jade," he said. Her name in his mouth had always been different from other words, heavier, more deliberate, as though he was aware each time of what it cost him to say it, what it admitted. "I need to tell you something that I have never told anyone. Not Derek, not anyone." She turned slightly toward him, waited. "I was 14 years old," he said, "when my mother sold my contract to the organization. That is not a metaphor. There was a document. There was a number. She had debts, and I was the asset with the most recoverable value. And she made a calculation, and I was the result of it." He said this without affect, not because it didn't matter, but because he had carried it for so long in such a specific interior location that narrating it had taken on the quality of reading from a text he had memorized. "I spent the next 6 years learning that attachment was liability, that wanting things made you predictable, that the only safe position was one in which you needed nothing from anyone that they could choose to withhold." Jade had gone very still beside him. "And then I walked into a room at 34 years old," he continued, "and you were standing on the other side of it laughing at something and everything I had spent 20 years building as a philosophy of survival became completely, immediately useless. And I married you anyway, because you were the first thing I had ever wanted that I was also afraid of. And my mother taught me, his jaw tightened briefly, then released, that the things you are afraid of losing are the things that leave. The silence that followed was not empty. Jade reached out and placed her hand over his, the one resting flat on the table, the one that never shook, the one that had installed the surveillance application with 40-second precision and was now simply lying there, open, with nowhere particular to be. She did not say, "It's okay." She did not say, "I forgive you." She was too honest for either of those, too precise with language, too respectful of what words actually meant to deploy them as comfort before they were true. What she said was, "You are going to have to work for this, Hyunwoo. Not for me. For yourself. For the person you want to be inside this family. Because I am not raising our child in a house where love looks like surveillance. I won't do it." "I know," he said. "I need more than I know." "I made an appointment," he said, "for therapy. I went today, before I came home." She looked at him for a long moment, searching his face with that quality of attention she had, the one that had always made him feel like the most examined and simultaneously the most accepted person in any room. "Today," she said, "this afternoon, after I heard the call, I called Derek. He had a referral. I went directly from the office." Something moved through her expression that was complex and slow, and arrived finally in her eyes as the particular brightness that precedes tears not of sadness, but of something that does not have a clean single name. Relief mixed with love, mixed with the exhaustion of having hoped for something for a long time, and seeing the first real evidence that it was possible. She did not cry. She was too composed for that in this moment. Too present. But the brightness was there. "How was it?" she said. "Terrible," he said. "I have a great deal of material." She laughed. It arrived without warning, the way her best laughs always did. Not built toward, not performed, just suddenly there, loose and real, and filling the kitchen with a warmth that the marble and the imported stone and the security systems and everything else the money had purchased could not have produced on their own. It was the laugh he had heard across a room 4 years ago, and followed without fully understanding why. It was the laugh he had burned down 20 years of self-protective architecture to be near. He felt something in his chest that he did not have adequate language for. Not in Korean, not in English, the two languages he inhabited, neither of which had been built to accommodate what Jang Hyun-woo felt sitting in a dark kitchen in Atlanta at 10:30 at night, beside the woman who was carrying his child and had just laughed at his terrible joke about having a great deal of therapeutic material. He reached into the space under the counter beside him, the ledge below the kitchen island where he had placed it when he came home, and set the object on the table. A frame. Expensive. Matte black with a clean white interior mount. Inside it, a pregnancy test. Jade stared at it, then at him. "You framed a pregnancy test," she said. "It is the most significant document I have ever encountered," he said. "And I have encountered documents that moved significant amounts of money across significant numbers of borders." "Hyun-woo, I also inquired about having one cast in gold, but the lead time was 3 weeks, and I felt the occasion was more immediate." "You are completely insane," she said. "Yes," he agreed. "But I am yours." She looked at him for a long time, at the tattoos and the scar, and the open hands, and the ridiculous framed pregnancy test on the kitchen table, and the man behind all of it, who had just, for the first time in his life, told the truth about where he came from, and sat still while someone decided what to do with him. She stood, walked to him, and wrapped both arms around his shoulders from behind, her chin resting on the top of his head, her hands meeting at his chest, directly over the place where the thing without adequate language was still moving. He put both hands over hers. They stayed like that for a long time. The city outside moving and indifferent. The house around them holding its breath. The framed test on the table between the phone and the silence, and the long wreckage of a fear that had finally, at considerable cost, and in the most ironic possible manner, been named out loud. "You're going to keep going," she said quietly. "To the appointments." "Every one," he said. "And you are going to talk to me," she said. "When something is wrong, before it becomes surveillance." "Yes." "And when this baby comes," she said, and her voice shifted on those words, became softer, became the voice underneath the voice, the one he had heard alone in a corridor recording, the one that was afraid and hopeful and holding both at once. "You are going to be there. Not managed, not performing. Actually there." "Jade," he said. "Yes. I have been afraid of exactly one thing in my adult life," he said. "And it has always been losing you. Every surveillance system, every controlled variable, every managed distance. It was all the same fear wearing different clothes. And I understand now that the only way to actually lose you is to keep doing what I have been doing. So I am done with it. Not because I am no longer afraid, because the fear is not worth more than this." He meant the kitchen, the frame, the hands over his, the 8 weeks and 4 days. All of it. She pressed her lips to the top of his head, brief and certain. "Then we start from here," she said. "From here," he agreed. And for the first time in as long as either of them could honestly remember, the silence in the room was simply silence. Not the silence of a man lying to himself. Not the silence of a woman carrying something alone. Not the particular loaded quiet of two people orbiting each other's pain without ever making contact. Just two people. In a kitchen. At the beginning of something. With a great deal of material. And, for the first time, the willingness to work through it.
Jade didn't need to scream. She didn't need to beg. She didn't need to explain her pain 10 times to be understood. She simply remained whole, and that was enough for him to realize what he was about to lose. But here's the truth no one tells. Not every story ends with a man waking up. Sometimes the man remains confused, remains hot and cold, continues to take what you offer without offering anything back. And the question that matters isn't, will he change? The question is, will you still be available when he decides he won't? If you're tired of translating red flags into excuses, of waiting for the right version of someone, of silently carrying what should be shared, this reset was made for you. The Woman He Can't Manipulate is a 30-day guide that gives back what confusion takes away, your own vision. It doesn't teach you to be tough. It teaches you to be harder to deceive. The link is in the QR code on the screen now, or in the video description, or in the pinned comment below. 30 days, one at a time, starting with you.
If this story moved you, stop for a moment and reflect. Have you ever loved someone so completely that you protected them even from their own fears? even when they were hurting you without realizing it? And have you ever been so afraid of losing something real that you almost destroyed it with your own hands? Not out of cruelty, but out of a wound so old you had stopped noticing it was still bleeding. Tell us your experiences and feelings in the comments. We read them all. And if you believe in stories about redemption, trust, and the courage it takes to love without armor, leave a like. Be sure to subscribe to the channel and click join to become a part of our community and help the channel.